Welcome to the Be Bold podcast. I'm Beth Whitman. Thanks for joining me today. The Be Bold podcast is where I feature conversations with women who have inspirational stories to share. These are women who come from a wide range of backgrounds and who are forging their own paths to success. The one thread they have in common is that they are bold in what they do. They follow what they love and somehow have created a lifestyle that supports it. These conversations are actually really inspiring for me. I love listening to the stories of how these women found and followed their passions. I always have at least several aha moments or bits of realization when I have these conversations, and I always really enjoy re-listening to it. I hope you get something out of it as well. Please take a moment to subscribe to the podcast in Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or Google Play and leave a review. And that literally just takes a couple of minutes. Maybe more importantly, please introduce someone to the podcast whom you think might get something out of it. That will help build our Be Bold community. Today's guest is Betsy Napper. Betsy is the co-director of the Tibetan Nuns Project, which happens to be located here in Seattle. The organization started 30 years ago in northern India, where Betsy had been traveling, and she's been a part of the organization for 25 years now. Betsy is a scholar of Tibet and Tibetan Buddhism. She's the author of the book Dependent Arising and Emptiness, a Tibetan Buddhist interpretation of Madhyamika philosophy. And look, I'm a Buddhist practitioner, and don't worry, even the title of that one's over my head. She's also the translator and editor of Mind in Tibetan Buddhism and co-editor of Kindness, Clarity, and Insight by His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. Though she now spends most of her time in Seattle, she does spend quite a bit of time in Dharamsala, India. And really, between the two of us and our travel schedules, we were really lucky to be in the same place at the same time to record this. The Tibetan Nuns Project works with refugee nuns, actually over 800 of them right now, and these are nuns from Tibet who have relocated to India. In this episode, she gives us a bit of historical perspective on what happened to the Tibetans when they fled to India due to Chinese rule in the 50s. We also talk about how in the 80s, she, as a Western woman, had access to things that women in the Buddhist tradition just normally don't have access to, and how her work with the Dalai Lama helped open doors for her. My big takeaway from our conversation was how Betsy observed that these nuns in Northwest India needed help, and she figured out a way to do it. She realized that, unlike the monks, the nuns did not have access to scholastic study, and not being schooled meant that they didn't have the education to start up their own institutions. Betsy and her colleagues helped change all that when she left her job teaching at Stanford to work in a field that she felt she was uniquely qualified for. Betsy wasn't alone in making the Tibetan Nuns Project successful, but she was one woman with a desire to help many others. And she figured out where her talents could be best utilized and put herself to work, following her passion. May we all find our path like Betsy did. With that, enjoy this conversation with Betsy Napper. Were you tempted by the cupcake?
I was not.
How could you not be? I just had a meeting there the other day. So tell me what kind of coffee you had this morning.
I had my first Americano.
Your first Americano?
It took me this many years to figure out that when you want a double shot and no milk products, the Americano is the drink of choice.
It is indeed.
Okay.
So Americano, and yep, when they don't have a drip coffee, then because I'm the same way, I like a black
right.
coffee.
Well, a drip wasn't going to do it. I needed 2 shots.
Okay, good. Thank you so much for coming to West Seattle today and chatting with me about the Tibetan Nuns Project, which I personally think is a wonderful project, having spent, well, quite a bit of time in India, where I know part of the organization is based, and having an affinity for Buddhism and nuns. I'm really excited to chat with you, so welcome.
Thank you.
So let's start, as we often do with the Be Bold podcast. I'd like to find out where you are today, kind of your position with the organization, and what you're doing here in Seattle, and kind of where you're splitting your time. So give us a little bit of context of what it is you are doing and why you're here right now.
So my official title is I'm the co-director of the Tibetan Nuns Project, and we are an organization that does all of our work in India. We're focused on providing education to nuns in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, which includes those from Tibet, refugees. We can't work in Tibet, but many refugees have come out to India, as well as women from the border areas of India who are traditionally Buddhist and whose ethnicity is Tibetan, although at this point some of them don't speak Tibetan anymore. They have to learn Tibetan when they come to study, but from the areas of Ladakh, Zanskar, Spiti, Lahul, those areas. We maintain an office here in Seattle, which is our fundraising office, and we have been operating now we're celebrating our 30th anniversary. I've been involved for 25 of those 30 years. And so the U.S., our main office, our only office in the U.S. is here in Seattle.
So the majority of the organization is based in northern India, and you're working with Tibetan nuns throughout that region.
Yes, the office in the U.S. is an administrative and fundraising office, and we give educational talks about nuns and things, but all of our program work is done in India, and our offices there are in the area near Dharamsala. We're down off the mountain, and then we support over 800 nuns and nuns from the four main traditions of Tibetan Buddhism. Most of those are within range to visit, although also we help nuns in Spiti and in Zanskar, which are remote regions of India.
How do you find these nuns, or how do they find you?
When we were first getting going, which was when I got involved and we really kind of developed our educational goals and program, that was the early 90s, and there were many nuns coming out of Tibet. Tibet has been under communist Chinese control since, 49 was when they first came across the borders. 59 was when the Dalai Lama fled Tibet, and 100,000 refugees with him. Then it was closed up tight for many years. And in the 80s, things began to open up a bit.
When you say closed up tight, do you mean that there was a time period when it was very difficult for them to leave?
They could not leave. The communist Chinese, having taken over, really sealed the border.
Okay, I hadn't realized that.
There was systematic destruction of monasteries. Monks and nuns were imprisoned. Huge effort to completely stop any practice of the Buddhist religion.
And what years
that went on from 59 until, I'd say, 81.
Oh, okay. Boy.
And in 81, and this name isn't going to come right back to me, but one of the leaders of Tibet, an important figure in the party, visited Tibet and said, "This looks like colonialism." And there began a period of some loosening up. There was communication. In fact, there had been no communication. People who had fled Tibet had no idea what was going on with their families. In the 80s, that began to loosen. They actually invited some delegations back, and it's telling on how, the upper levels, but lower level party members report up what's wanted to be heard, not necessarily what's happening. So inviting back the first delegations, the high level thought that they went and warned the Tibetans, be nice to them, don't make them feel welcome. Well, of course, when they got back, huge crowds flocked to them, and people were just in tears and telling the stories of what had happened. And really, it had been so dire that people were wearing the Tibetan dress is called a chuba. It's, kind of a large wraparound thing. They were wearing the same ones they'd had that were all patches. There was no original chuba anymore. It was just patches held together. That's how dire it was. And then, so things were kind of opening up. I had studied Tibetan Buddhism for many years, done my dissertation research in India, never thought I'd get to Tibet.
When was that? When were you studying?
I started grad school in 76. I did dissertation research in India in 81, 82. 87, we suddenly realized that Tibet was open, and it was funny. I went to Tibet with my husband, and there were people. Every day I'd go down, I'd meet somebody new, a friend of mine who was also in the field. We had all figured out this was our chance. And it was an amazing year because it was like wide open. We could go where we wanted, talk to who we wanted to.
This was 87?
87.
That's when you went.
Everyone we met, all the Tibetans, had two things to say to us. They wanted the Chinese to leave, and they wanted the Dalai Lama to come back, or they wanted to meet the Dalai Lama. And I thought, this is wonderful, but this is not in the best interests of a repressive government. And that fall, in the fall of 87, there was a demonstration led by some monks, and it was in support of the Dalai Lama, who was announcing a proposed peace plan to the U.S. Congress. And that demonstration, again, caught the authorities by surprise, but it led to a huge crackdown. But it also led to more demonstrations, because that first group of monks had led the first one, and then monks and nuns from the whole Lhasa area came out to show their support as well.
So if I'm following this correctly, and this is I know a little bit about what happened in Tibet, but the level of detail here is new to me and disheartening as always, but also very interesting. So I just want to make sure that I have it correct. The Dalai Lama fled in
1959.
And then there was a big clampdown. The government started to loosen up a little bit in the early to mid 80s. Mm-hmm. But then when people started to come back, the government started to
crack down again,
freak out. So did all that happen pretty quickly? Like in 87, you went, and there were a lot of other people going, and then was it a pretty quick
over
response?
Just a few years? 87. I mean, it never went back to as bad as it had been. But so 87, it was wide open. I went back again in 88, and I could go, but it was much more controlled. People were much more cautious. In 89, there was another round of demonstrations, and martial law was imposed. And from then on, it's never been wide open and free the way it was then. But people have been able to go in and out at various, they'll sometimes, if there's a particular holiday coming up that they think there might be trouble around, things will get closed for weeks or a couple of months, but then it'll open up because the tourism has been such an important part of the economy. And that was what was also happening, that was the time where tourism in the early years was really driving the Chinese economy for a while.
I know they had that speed train open up.
That was in the 90s.
It seemed like it had kind of
late 90s.
Yeah, it seemed like it had opened up a little bit at that point as well.
Well, it comes and goes. It's never been closed as tight as it was during those years from 59 to 80. But there's a great deal of effort to restrict the flow of information.
Still.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Well, it just seems so ridiculous when we are bombarded, in the rest of the world, we're so bombarded with information. It seems crazy to me that a country can clamp down so hard. I mean, North Korea is in that same space where they just clamp down so much.
Well, we're kind of naive about repressive regimes, but the control of the media, the control of information is huge, and the government has systematically taught the population of China that Tibet is an integral part of China and always has been. This, of course, is not the Tibetans' view of their own country. And so they don't want wide open and free flow of information because the truth would not support their presentation of history. And another year that was a big problem was the 2008, the year that the Olympics were held in China, because many amongst the Tibetan opposition groups, the exile community, felt that was their, in a way, last big chance to really shine the spotlight on China and what was happening. And so there were huge demonstrations that year that really brought things, drew attention, but also brought a huge and substantial clampdown. You can't be an open opposition person in Tibet. That's not allowed. Right? And free flow of information is not allowed. However, that said, in this modern world, you can't stop everything. So, people can phone Tibet. They can phone their families in Tibet now. All sorts of things that didn't used to be possible. But the political control is very tight.
So that is the current situation there. How did you find yourself? Like you said that you had studied this back in the 70s, 80s.
70s and into the 80s.
What was your draw? What was your interest at that point? Were you a Buddhist practitioner?
Yes, I had spent some years in a Tibetan Buddhist center in New Jersey in the early 70s, and then I went to the University of Virginia where I did a PhD in Buddhist studies. And really what drew me to this whole question of education for nuns was the point at which I realized that, like most of the Westerners studying things to do with Tibet, we were engaging with monks. And the tradition that I was studying in has a very advanced academic tradition. And I had had remarkable access to that tradition. And at some point...
In what way?
Well, in the sense that I was at the University of Virginia, we would bring in senior, really good scholars, and they taught the men and the women equally. We all had our projects, and we would go and have individual classes, and we had access. When we were doing dissertation research in India, back in those days, the Dalai Lama wasn't nearly as busy as he is now, and we could get an audience with him, and then having taken my questions to him, he said to me, well, you should take your questions to this person and that person and the other person, and if you walk in and you say, the Dalai Lama sent me, most likely that person will give you time and energy. So I understood that basically I'd had kind of the honorary guy pass, even though I was a woman, and the Tibetan situation, the way the institutions were set up, the women just didn't have that access.
Were there other scholars in your area, like at UVA? Were you one of the only women in that program, or there were other women?
There were other women as well.
But you recognize that as a Western woman, you had different access to...
Yeah, and that's not because there was any kind of systematic exclusion. In the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, the emphasis has been that, the monastic life is a what do you say? It's kind of not a career choice in the sense that we make career choices, but the monastics are the people who study the tradition and explain it and do it in detail. And the lay people, their job in a way is to support the monastics. So neither lay men or women would know a whole lot about the specific, the deep philosophical issues within the tradition. But for the monks, there was this tradition of institutions, scholastic institutions of study, and that tradition just wasn't there for the women. And
by tradition.
By tradition. Women were more expected to be meditators, and there was a great tradition of advanced women, not as big as with the men, but advanced women meditators. And then this was all compounded by the fact that coming into exile, institutions had all had to be rebuilt. And the monasteries immediately set about rebuilding their institutions. Far fewer nuns even came out. Many more stayed behind. When they did come out, many of them initially got involved in supporting the exile community. So they worked in the schools, in the orphanages, doing things like that. But then the other thing I realized once we did get education started and set up is how much of education isn't just education, but is administrative skills, knowing how to get things done. And without education, people tend not to have those skills. So that had also held the nuns back from starting up and building up their own institutions.
Were they just not being educated even at a basic level, or was it...
Well, again, Tibet was a pre-literate society in 59. And so there were, amongst the nobility, there was some education. They tended to send their kids out to India to get it in schools in India. And the other education that there was in the monastic institutions. So, again, there was a channel for the monks, but that the nunneries were not similarly a channel for education. They were a channel for doing prayers and meditation.
So you did your dissertation, and what was that dissertation on specifically?
It was on I don't know how to give a two-sentence description of this.
I know, and you don't need to. You don't need to give a two-sentence.
Within Buddhism, there is the highest teachings are called the teachings of wisdom and focus on the nature, what's called emptiness. And so the book that I eventually published that came out of that was called Dependent Arising and Emptiness. And it's a philosophical question, which is much debated. How much can you deny the substantial reality of what's around us and yet maintain a functional world? And that's the philosophical middle way that Buddhist philosophy claims to find, but there are many, over the centuries, there have been many different presentations, different ways of saying that that's been found. And so the Tibetans have done a lot of research, a lot of study, a lot of meditation on this. And so I was translating a text by one of the great figures of one of the four main traditions, Tsongkhapa, his presentation of finding that balance point between what they call kind of nihilism and over-reification of things.
Okay, that last statement is a little bit out of my league, but I understand some of that other. I understand, and maybe this is boiling it down for the listeners too, is that living in the real world while still maintaining a Buddhist practice, and that's what you were studying. Is it like a simplification of that?
No, that's too practical.
Okay.
It's really what they're looking for is the philosophical. It's a philosophical refinement of how you describe the ultimate nature of reality, and that's what's been much debated. And although there are many different ways of taking that to be what they would say more and more subtle, all of them would be in complete agreement with what you just laid out as the basic, what we need to live our lives in a meaningful way.
So here you're studying, you do your dissertation, and you spent time in India at that point to work on the dissertation also and gain some knowledge there. At what point did it really click for you? Like, these women need some help, and I think that I can encourage them and help them along with their education.
Well, I was at a point in my life when I had become aware of women's issues and women's vulnerabilities. And I was thinking about a community with which I had a connection. I hadn't actually had much of a connection with the nuns because I had gone straight to the monks for the advanced studies. But I realized that this was an area where there was a lot that needed to be done and could be done. And I found allies within the Tibetan community who were interested in doing that, because that kind of change has to really come from within a community. And it just seemed like it was a good use of my knowledge and my skills. I actually, at the time that I decided to kind of leave the academic world and get involved in this project, I'd been teaching at Stanford in a very junior position where I was doing a job that any one of 300 people could have done just as well as I was doing it. And when I got to India and we were starting to talk about setting up our first educational institution and developing the curriculum, and I realized I was the only woman in the group of us working together who even knew what that traditional curriculum should be. So it was an issue of really having a motivation and finding the group where my particular set of skills would be of use and of help.
You're not technically the founder of the Tibetan Nuns Project, is that correct?
That's right. I'm not technically the founder.
Okay. So it had started, and I know this because we chatted before we started recording. It was another organization, or it was the start of the organization before you became involved?
The Tibetan Nuns Project had existed from 1987, and its director is a woman named Rinchen Kando Chogyal, who is the sister-in-law of the Dalai Lama. She was also the first president of the Tibetan Women's Association, and it had really come into being under her auspices and the auspices of the Tibetan Women's Association. And then it had, it was still there, but it had been kind of puttering quietly along. And I got to India in 1990 with this idea and wish to do something, and we met up, and it was kind of with a little checking each other out time. We both felt we could work together, and so then it was from there that we really developed our plan. And someone that was also in Dharamsala at the time donated some funds for the purchase of land, and so that's where we started from.
And she's still the co-founder or the founder of the organization?
And she's the director of the Tibetan Nuns Project.
Okay, so that's a long time to be committed to an organization for both of you. 30 years for her and 25
And we
so
have another nun who's worked with us from 1991. the Venerable Losang Dechen, who she and I are the two co-directors, and then Rinchen Khandola is the director. And yeah, we've all been in it for this whole time.
Yeah. And you've been splitting your time between the U.S. and India, is that correct?
Yes.
And what are your roles when you're switching back and forth?
Well, when we started, really the work that had to be done, all had to be done in India. So I was mostly in India. I was there probably 9 or 10 months of the year. And we were starting from nothing. As I've said, that's when I understood about administrative skills coming along with education, because initially I had such a role to play over there just in terms of writing up the proposals and often having to do correspondence and kind of putting together the plans, writing the reports, and being a sound, throwing out the new ideas. 8 out of 10 would get knocked down, but that was more my role. And what we were doing was all there. We had volunteer help on the U.S. who were kind of maintaining the organization and organizing the funding. A friend of mine who I was telling about it, Pat Rockwell, said to me, I could help with that. And she figured out the database, and for years she ran it out of her bedroom, after midnight, after the kids had all gone to sleep. Mm-hmm. So we started really small and built up, and most of the work was in India. And that went on till 2005 when we finally got our main institution built, got it dedicated. And at that point, I felt I had to focus my effort more back to the U.S. end and to getting this office built up, stable.
And is that
ongoing.
Mainly for fundraising purposes?
And it's mainly for fundraising purposes, yeah.
You had mentioned your main center there and having the dedication for it. I know that you have several nunneries that you support. Is that correct? Are there 4?
Yeah, there are. Actually now there are 6 nunneries where we find sponsors. There are 2 that we support entirely, and one is called Domaling, and it's a non-sectarian nunnery, although it does education more within the Gelug tradition.
And when you say non-sectarian, just for listeners, you mean that there are various forms of
there are Buddhism is different from country to country, but also within the Tibetan Buddhist tradition there are 4 main traditions. And one of the things that we did that was quite unusual was that we wanted to help nuns from all the traditions. We were really focused on education for nuns. So that's what we have always pushed. And to do that, we started Domaling Nunnery, which is officially non-sectarian, but it's interesting. Once you start, you realize that textbooks are kind of linked one way or another. So it follows the tradition more like the Gelug. We also started another nunnery, Shuksep, which is of the Nyingma tradition, and we fully support it. And then there were 2 existing nunneries in the Dharamsala area, Ganden Chuling, which is Gelug, Tilokpur, which is Gagyu. And so we were also helping them to get educational programs going. Those were the first 4. Since then, we've also reached out to nunneries in the border area, and we help Sherab Chuling in Spiti and Dorjezong in Zanskar, which are remote Himalayan border areas.
And those are those nunneries?
Those are
specifically
nunneries.
That you're helping?
Yeah.
Okay. Had you had any idea 25 years ago, 30 years ago, that this would have grown so large? Because you're supporting a lot of nunneries and 800 nuns, you said. That's huge.
We didn't know. We had an idea and we started. And it's been amazing to see that if you've got an idea and you work at it, you can make it happen. We did it bit by bit. It was all incremental and fundraising as we went along, but we managed to do it.
Did you have that vision early on, or was it just literally day by day, or would you have said, 20 years from now, we want to grow this into 10 nunneries?
No, we didn't. We really were working with what was there, and we have kind of responded to people coming to us for help, and we haven't necessarily done everything that people asked us if we didn't think we could do it. So it was more kind of organic, what we thought we could do, what we were being asked to do. And the wonderful thing that happened over the course of that time was seeing the idea of education take hold, so that it wasn't just us doing education, but within traditions, the male hierarchies realizing that, they needed to get behind it and help to make it happen.
For the nuns.
For the nuns. An important thing to keep in mind is that in the Tibetan tradition, we never ran across any overt obstacles. Women shouldn't be educated. Women can't be educated. There were no rules like that. It was more kind of benign neglect. And when you think about it, the women need to step up to the plate and, work on their own behalf. And we provided an incentive, but really, it's not, in a sense, the job of the monks who are working in their monasteries to turn around and set up the institutions for the nuns.
Well, that happens here all the time. I mean, it happens around the world, right? But there's always that feeling of it's benign neglect. I like that. I like that term. But when you just think of women in the workforce here and not being paid as much, or not starting businesses, or whatever it might be, it happens everywhere. And for you, it sounds like there was just this light that shone on the discrepancy that was happening.
Well, it was the light that shone on the discrepancy, and it was the realization that it was a doable change. That if the women had education and had the confidence to take charge of their lives, they could do it.
So now you've been splitting your time between Dharamsala and North India and the U.S. You're spending more time here in the U.S. now, is that right?
I am spending more time now. You pointed out we've been involved for 25 years, and all of us are now thinking retirement thoughts. And none of us are exactly replicable. So what I've been doing is focusing more on the U.S. end and trying to get that. Well, we made the jump. We had some wonderful help in the late 90s to get our first paid position. And then we moved the office up here in 2005. Now
and your main office is here in Seattle?
Our only office is here in Seattle. Our only U.S.
Fair enough, yeah.
office is here in Seattle. Bit by bit, we've been, now we have an ED who runs the office, and we, in this modern world, have, are set up to take most donations online, and all of those kind of automating of processes that are life in the modern world. When we started, it was all, hands-on, one-on-one. I knew the names of all the sponsors, that kind of thing. And now we're getting things, what do you say? Not the word isn't mechanized, but, getting it online.
Yeah, a little bit more automated.
There we go, automated.
When you started out with your dissertation, had you considered yourself, and do you to this day consider yourself a Buddhist practitioner?
Yes, I do.
Not just a scholar. So are you a meditator?
Not a very good one.
I think everyone says that, whether you're 5 minutes a day or 45 minutes a day. So you had this interest to begin with.
Yeah, I was interested in Buddhism from the first time I read about it when I was 16 years old, and then I'd spent years in a Tibetan center in New Jersey.
Where was that center?
In Washington, New Jersey, the hills of western New Jersey.
Yeah, are you from New Jersey?
No, I'm from Wisconsin.
Okay, because I'm from Jersey, so that's why I asked. Yeah, and I'm not. Is that center still there in Washington? Mm-hmm. Okay, what's it called?
Tibetan Buddhist Learning Center. It's there's a Kalmyk Mongolian community in South Jersey, and that's where the original monastery had been, Freewood Acres. And then the founder of that had spent time up in the northwestern part of the state because of an illness, and found a piece of land and built his center, and that's where it still is. Do
you support any centers here in the U.S. or any of the nuns here in the U.S., or is it strictly in India?
We don't. All nuns need support and help, but the Tibetan nuns were so much farther behind that's where we've really put our efforts. And again, it's because we see education as the way everyone can take care of themselves. So although we would really like to be supporting Western nuns as well, Western nuns basically have education. And our focus is education on giving the nuns the access to that so that they can shape their own futures. Some of the Western nuns have studied in institutions that we're helping.
And the education that they're getting, is it twofold, that it's both in their Buddhist practice as well as you said earlier, kind of administration and helping them run a business and educate others and in the school system, or is it?
No, it's So when we first started, we were going to educate them in everything. We had just the most ambitious ideas of what we were going to do. The best of the traditional, the best of the modern, English, Tibetan, you name it, all of it. And we came up against several things. First, we realized that if the nuns were going to get recognition within their own traditions, they needed to get the traditional education. They needed to be fully competent in that. And that meant we couldn't add in a whole lot of other stuff that they were also supposed to be learning, because that in itself is a very rigorous education. Furthermore, the situation we were dealing with, especially in the early 90s when we were getting going and there were lots of refugees coming out of Tibet, is that we were getting illiterate young adults, basically. And we had to first we thought we'll educate everybody. And then we realized that the 13-year-olds were really too young, and the 40-year-olds who were illiterate, you can still learn after you're 40, but if you're illiterate, it's really late to start. So we set an entrance age of 14 to 24 for admittance of new nuns. But so we were in a sense doing literacy education for young adults, which was another part of what we were doing. So although we would have liked them to be learning everything, our focus in the early stages was on getting them the degrees of their own traditions. And our first group of nuns, in December of 2016, 20 nuns got this highest degree of the Geshe-ma, given to them by the Dalai Lama, and recognizing that they had completed 17 years of study and 4 years of examinations on everything they had studied.
And are they from a range of ages?
They're all, by now, I'd say they're 30 to 40s. And they represent 5 different nunneries that we've been working with over many years.
And how many did you say?
20.
20 of them.
Yeah.
If I understand the process, the organization was started 30 years ago, and in that 10 years, you've been kind of setting up the program, and then you had this official program that started 20 years ago.
We started education from, say, 91 or 92, but when we were starting up, it would be stopped because we didn't have permanent housing. The nuns were having to help with building the housing. We didn't have regular teachers because we were just, nobody knew who we were. It was very hard to find teachers. So it wasn't in the early years like it was just boom, boom, boom. Here, come in, start. This is the course of study. It was evolving. So it was, in those days, it was much more work. Now the things are in place. You have admissions every year. You start. When we first started, we were letting people in as they came out of Tibet. And then you realize that was blowing up all the classes because the teachers couldn't make any progress because there kept being new people. So it was all learning as we did it. Actually, the architect we had, and we designed what's really worked out to be a lovely facility and has done what we needed. But the architect commented about the 3 of us who were the main directors of this. You're a bunch of amateurs. And we were,
This was back then or
this
now?
was back then. Because we just thought, well, this is what we need and we're going to do it. Yeah. And it was a steep learning curve, but it worked.
What made you think at that time that it would work? That gave you, to use my be bold term, like kind of that boldness or that, sometimes it's not foresight. Sometimes it's just, this is what needs to be done. Where did that come? Where did that desire come from for you?
I think it's because I've always had a thirst for knowledge, and I was just really driven to share that access to knowledge with others. I don't know. We didn't, we knew we wanted to do it, and we set out to do it. But we were in a community. We weren't, there weren't huge walls up against us, so that it was possible to think, well, if we persist, we can do this. It was a time when Tibet was very much in the news, and so there was awareness. And because there were these refugees coming out of Tibet, and because there was a repressive Chinese crackdown going on, we could find an audience. So in a sense, we weren't just doing education; we were doing refugee crisis, and that gave us a broader platform.
Is it more difficult now because Tibet and the China issue isn't in the news quite as much?
It is somewhat different. The education message resonates, and now that we have results to show, that's important. But it is true, Tibet, it's not, people don't know about Tibet now the way they used to. And it's interesting because, of course, since I've been deeply involved in it my whole adult life, basically, it's good for me to meet people and realize, oh, everybody doesn't know anymore this history of what happened and how it evolved.
Right. It just struck me just now that there are generations now coming up that don't know about it. And, I've never been to China. I've never been to Tibet. It's an area of the world. I travel a lot to Southeast Asia, and people are constantly asking me, have you been to Tibet? And I have a difficult time wanting to go because of the Chinese government. And whether that's fair or not, I don't know, because I believe that the people are not their government. And I believe that about the U.S. I believe that.
Right. We better believe that right now. Yeah. Yes.
I believe that about here. I believe that about other countries as well. But I still have a really difficult time with that. And so it hasn't been high on my list. But then because of my travels and because of my interest in Buddhism and that part of the world, I do have a knowledge about it. And as I said, it just struck me now that, there are younger people who just, it's not in their periphery, it's not, they just have no knowledge about that, which is pretty sad. But what you're doing is fantastic. And certainly let's try to get the word out a little bit more about that. I can imagine at that time, when you were in Dharamsala and in India, and the refugees were coming across, and Tibet was so closed, I can imagine that the Tibetans that were coming across were so open and excited and open-minded. Maybe not open-minded, but
no, I'm laughing when you say that, just because the first one, or in the early years when people were coming out, they had been under this repressive Chinese government for many years at that point, and
some of them probably all their life.
Yes, the younger ones all their life. Mm-hmm. And they knew that government lied to them. And they knew they wanted to learn about their own tradition and their own religion, which they couldn't do in Tibet. So they were very focused on that. And it was interesting because things that we take for granted, they didn't know. And so there were a lot of health problems because Tibet's such a different climate, and they would get to India and get sick. And we would try, the health people, not just us, but Tibetans, we would try to explain, it's the germ theory of disease, right? That's a given for us. But it was so interesting because as it's being kind of presented to recent arrivals, they're kind of going, well, we've been told a lot of false things in our life. Why should we believe this one? It was really very interesting.
Yeah.
So it was a learning curve. So it was a long learning curve.
Bit of skepticism with everything.
Yeah.
Huh. I know I had traveled to Vietnam in the early 90s, which was also under a repressive regime, communist. And just in the early 90s, as things were just starting to open up and more tourists were coming into the country, there was that excitement, especially in the South, that excitement of people just eager to chat with a Westerner and to learn what was going on in the world. So that's kind of my perspective. I'm projecting that on to the Tibetans. I'm sure there was that same feeling, but with that kind of mixed in with that skepticism, which is really fascinating.
Yeah, well, like when I first went to Tibet in the mid '80s, that was what it was more like in Tibet. But by the time it's India, people coming out, there was this shift. We've come for what's ours, for our traditional learning, and that's what we trust. And everything else kind of had to come slowly. And it did, the things are very different now. But it wasn't like, things that we have utter confidence in as fact, that necessarily transferred over by any means.
What was your reaction or response to India when you first went?
My first trip to India was in the early 70s. I spent my senior year of college there, living in Varanasi.
Oh, in Varanasi. Oh, my gosh.
Started studying Tibetan with the Ladakhi at the Sanskrit University, which involved riding my bicycle across the city and back every day. So I had a very, I'd had that year of being there. And things were very, very different then, because that was really India was in a very different state than it was even in the 80s when the next time I went back. So I've had...
Did you love it at that point, or did you tolerate it, or...
I loved it. I loved it. It was actually my first time out of the country, was to go to India for a year.
It was one of my first big international trips too. That's why I asked, but I didn't fall in love with it.
Well, the thing about India is you can't tell anyone why they should love it. You either do or you don't. It's kind of that simple. But it's so alive. That's what I love about India.
Yeah.
And it's so kind. I have never been in a difficult situation in India where people didn't just appear to help. It's always been my experience of India.
I do find that the people in India are quite kind and will quite literally give you the shirt off their back, if they need to, or you comment on a bracelet that you think is pretty and they'll take it off and hand it to you. There is that. There is a lot of... It's difficult too. It's an assault on your senses as well. I haven't been to Dharamsala or northern India yet, but after this conversation, I may go look into that, into going there. And I imagine that it's a little bit more peaceful up in that northern area than it is in Varanasi. Oh
yes, absolutely. The Himalayan area is just a lovely region.
I look forward to it. And you've been to Bhutan. You said that you were doing trips to Bhutan.
Yeah, I've been to Bhutan many times. Yeah. And I really like Bhutan.
Lucky you. You've got a great life. What, as we just wrap up here, I'm curious, what are the biggest needs? I know on your website, it's a really wonderful website, and I will link to it in the show notes. And you've got a number of ways that people can help the different projects that you have. What are some of your biggest needs, if you just can boil it down to maybe the top 2 or 3?
Well, ongoing sponsorship is an important need because we have kept it at $30 a month, the same rate, for many years now, because $360 is a significant donation. We don't feel like we can ask people to give more than that, in an ongoing way. But in fact, costs have gone up. And so in some of the larger nunneries, we're actually finding 2 sponsors per nun. So that money is just that's what they eat from. The basics are provided by that. We're also developing a project. Now that we've really gotten education up and running in the nunneries, one of the things we'd like to do is find a way to make that education available to lay girls, with Tibetan lay women, because that just hasn't been a traditional part, and now they're growing up and wanting to understand more about their tradition without necessarily having to become nuns. So that's a project we're developing and we'll be fundraising for soon.
How would you find those young girls?
They're there. They're coming to us, but we don't, you can't... The educational system was built around becoming ordained and then spending your life doing it. And just as in America, you don't have time now. You can't spend your whole life doing this very focused education. So now it's a matter of working out how we can introduce, a short course, basically, more like a graduate course or something like that. So we're working on that. We also sponsor the educational level we kind of stumbled into. It was started one year, and then we saw how successful it was, and we've kept it going. There's an inter-nunnery debate session that's held every year. And we get nuns from 5 or 6 nunneries together, and they debate with each other, which is it's a very active style of learning. And
this is very traditional of Buddhism.
Very traditional,
right?
Yes.
So it's to a foreigner, and when I first heard about this debate, that the monks are debating, it sounds really strange. But as you said, it's very much a part of the tradition.
It's very much a part, and what's really interesting about it is that it teaches people to think. And it really teaches people to look into... when a reason's given for something, is it a valid reason? It's interesting because times have changed in this day of fake news. The ability to actually look at things and understand what's true and what isn't true. So that, the classic is advertising, which is built all on false pervasions. If you use this product, your life will be wonderful. All your needs will be met. Well, no, that's not true. If you use this product, your hair might get clean, but not much more than that. But people, that kind of critical thinking is actually slipping away these days. there's people are less aware of those kinds of things. So that's what this is built on. It's looking at whether reasons for things are true and whether they call it deprivation, but what they claim is covered by that reason is actually covered by it. So it's a huge. Not only is it a learning device of a religious tradition, but it's actually really helps train in clear thinking. It's very practical.
Yeah, and just as you were talking about that, it just seems to me that there's the news, and discerning what's real and what's not is one thing, but there's also social media in which we base our decisions on what other people are doing or thinking, and that's TripAdvisor and Yelp, and not being out in the world and just being like you said, critical thinkers and forming opinions ourselves and being open to things on our own, which I think is just having that little takeaway from today's conversation and just is really key. Just thinking about how we can not have to be so informed or have input from everyone else in terms of that, and really thinking on our own, which I think is I think it's a serious issue, these days.
I think it is, and it's interesting this thing about debate, because you can't be in a bubble with your own ideas that you won't or can't defend, right? It's a back and forth process. And they also, it's a friend of mine coined the term group stimulated learning, because it's people in a class. They get some material and then they go out and they debate with each other. So everybody is kind of pushing each other to think, to learn to think. And nobody can get away with just taking a position and then, that they can't defend, that they won't defend, that isn't true. But it's not an authority figure telling you you're wrong. It's actually a back and forth with your peers that sharpens everybody's minds.
That's great. And as a person who works from a home office and I don't have a lot of interaction with people, for one thing, these conversations have been amazing to me because it does give me that opportunity to kind of think on my feet and process what's going on. But I sometimes joke, it's like sometimes I feel like I'm the smartest person in the room, and then I realize I'm the only person in the room. Yeah, and that's not a good thing. It's something that I'm very aware of that I need to change. So, yeah, I think I am delighted and excited to stay in touch with you. And I have one other question. As you think about the women, the nuns, and whether it's from this recent graduating class in December or other ones that you've worked with, is there one or more that kind of stand out as maybe quote unquote a success story to you? Either someone who's really excelled or gone on to do some interesting things, or who maybe really came from some sort of hardship that really came out of it, that you thought, oh yeah, she's why I did this.
I wouldn't say there's one, but there are nuns there that I've known for 25 years. And some of them are just remarkable individuals, and they're not always the ones who are the best students. There are a number who, this is a long and intensive course of study, who've decided that really wasn't for them, but have chosen other roles. So there's one nun who's become the media nun, and takes the pictures and has learned to make films and things. There's a nun who stopped to run the library. There's a rotating position within the nunnery of the people. Now they have a shop, who runs the shop. And just seeing that steadiness and that kindness and the attention focused on different tasks, but really embodying these core principles of kindness for others and service to community. It's been very inspiring.
Is it possible for people to visit the Tibetan Nuns Project in Dharamsala?
Yes, it's possible to visit. We're down off the mountain. People know where it is, and yes, people can go and visit.
Good. And then finally, and you may not have this information just offhand, and I can always follow up with you and add it to the show notes, but are there places on social media, as I just gave a hammer to, are there places on social media where we can find you other than the website?
There's a Facebook page, which will be Tibetan Nuns Project. I understand we even have a YouTube channel.
Okay.
Truthfully, I'm not much of an online person, but you should be able to search Tibetan Nuns Project on YouTube and find it.
Great. I did notice a couple of videos on your website, so I'm sure they're hosted on YouTube. Okay. Yeah. Instagram, Twitter, any of that fun stuff?
Twitter, yes. I've never been there myself, but I understand we have Twitter.
Great. Well, I'll add those so people can find you and link to the area on your website where people can also donate.
Super. That's great.
To. So thank you so much. Again, anything else that you'd like covered today?
No, this has kind of been a trip down memory lane. It's been an interesting, when you just do it every day, you don't step back and think about it. So it's been interesting.
Well, good. You're doing amazing work, and I love your story of, I don't think you stumbled into it, but you had a passion many years ago that you wanted to follow, and here you are 25 years later doing this really great thing that's good for humanity and good for the Tibetan nuns and good for yourself apparently too. So thank you for doing that, and thanks for taking the time today.
Well, thank you.
Boy, she's a smart one, isn't she? 25 plus years of studying Buddhism and ties to the Dalai Lama and all that time in India. She's pretty amazing. A reminder that if you like what you hear, please subscribe to the podcast in Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or Google Play, and leave a review. Those reviews really do help the podcast get more exposure and will ultimately help us grow our Be Bold community. I bet you know a few people in your world who would also enjoy today's episode and this podcast in general, so please do share. Podcasts are a new thing for some people, so if you've got a friend who doesn't know how to download them, take a moment to give them a lesson. I'm working on launching a website dedicated to the podcast, but in the meantime, you can find out more about me by visiting wanderlustandlipstick.com, as well as wandertours.com, and that's where you'll see the tours I lead around the world, including India, and also our culinary tours to Santa Fe, New Orleans, and Seattle. It's worth mentioning that soon you'll be able to purchase Be Bold gear and accessories. I encourage you to check out the Wander World Foundation, the nonprofit I founded to help women and children in developing countries. And I'll put links to all those sites in the show notes. You can find those all on wanderlustandlipstick.com/podcast. Sign up for my newsletter on the Wanderlust and Lipstick site, and you'll receive tips on making your travels more bold and a lot more safer. You can friend me on Facebook, and I'm WanderGal on Instagram. If you know of any high-performing, adventurous, philanthropic women whom you think might be a good guest, shoot me a note or leave a comment. And finally, the ladies can join us on our Be Bold Facebook group. That's where you'll find our growing community. It's where we share goals, talk about our setbacks, and where you can find words of encouragement and inspiration from others. Thank you for joining me for another episode of the Be Bold podcast. Until next time, be bold.